So again, my name is Adam Watson. I'm with the UT-TSU Extension here in Washington County. I'm one of our ag agents. And so tonight we're focusing on growing blueberries as part of our backyard fruit series. If you joined us for some of the others, we talked about pruning fruit trees. We talked broadly about pest control for fruits. But tonight we're going to talk more specifically about growing blueberries because this was a topic that was of interest to several people. And so I'm happy to present it this evening. Be aware that as we go along tonight, if I mention a brand name or a supplier or anything like that, it's not meant as an endorsement by myself nor the university. It's just a way for us to communicate better and have clarity. So we're not in the business of endorsing products, people, or suppliers, and just be aware of that. So why blueberries? Blueberries are one that have quite a bit of interest. Look at blueberries because one, there's a lot of consumer like for it. So a lot of homeowners, if they're looking for something fruit, the speed at which small fruits like blueberries, but as well as caneberries can come to bear is attractive. Blueberries specifically are fairly low on the maintenance spectrum. It doesn't mean there's zero maintenance associated with them, but certainly compared to some things that are in the fruit world, they're on the lower end. They can be long-lived. So, it's an investment to purchase them, to plant them. And so you want something that's going to last. And certainly rabbit eyes among blueberries, especially so, but even blueberries in general have a fairly lengthy life. And what's also interesting is we can have a decently long harvest season from these, depending what we pick. And one reason I think blueberries are particularly attractive is anthocyanins. That's what gives blueberries their blue color, is thought to be very health supporting. And so a lot of highly pigmented fruits are sought after because of that. And certainly blueberries are one that we can grow successfully and rather straightforwardly in our region. So the one big thing to understand about blueberries, when you plant them, you're basically looking at your first crop to actually occur in about year 3. So if we planted them now in 24, our first picking wouldn't happen until 26. Among fruit, that's not bad. So fruit aren't like vegetables where we get that quick gratification. It does take some time, and it takes time because we want to grow a plant that is well established and well suited to producing for a number of years. So we'll actually talk about how we prevent fruiting earlier than that. We actually don't get a full crop or a full potential crop off these plants until we're talking 6th or 8th year. So it can take a few years before they reach full, true, mature size. But again, we can start those harvests beginning the 3rd year. A fully mature plant, we can get 15 pounds of blueberries, which is quite a few. So that means you've got the ability to share those, to look at selling at farmers markets or whatever the case may be. We have basically 2 types we're going to focus on this evening. I'll mention one other, I think, maybe 2. High bush, they're the earlier picking harvest season. They're in June and July, and rabbit eye, they're later, July and August. So you can see just by selecting both types, we can have potential blueberry harvest from June through August. So quite a long period. The thing to understand about blueberries, I've said, we start our harvest in year 3. In truth, it's a 4-year process. Because what we would like to do is 12 months prior, look at establishing that site for those blueberries. And we'll talk in depth of what that is, but that pre-plant part of blueberries is extremely important. And then we go through. So we'll talk about this in more detail, but just kind of, I guess I was misleading you when I said in 3 years, because really we kind of have 1 year already in our pocket when we go to plant. So it's 3 years from planting. If we're talking about where we're placing these, pretty straightforward. We want full sun locations, which is almost the case for everything we're planting in the fruit world. The big issue or the big unique thing about blueberries is that they have a requirement for acidic soil. So if we're talking about soil pH, most things in our garden and our lawns, if we're running anywhere between 6 and 7, we'll be okay. That's not bad. We're not going to make a major adjustment to pH if we're in that range. But with blueberries, we would love to have the pH down to maybe 4 or 5. John Abe, there should be another one maybe on one of the ends of the table. If not, I'll get you one once we're done. Okay. Uh, and so when we look at blueberries, that pH requirement is different. And so that's why we have such a pre-plant requirement associated with these. It's really the pH. The other thing about blueberries, we really want to take pains to have high organic matter in our soils. So high organic matter is something that oftentimes we don't find in soils that we're actively cropping and working. So some of the things like tillage will burn through organic matter that is in the soil. We literally burn it up, it gets consumed. So oftentimes we don't have that in sites that we might be choosing to plant blueberries. So we do want to think about taking a moment when we're doing this establishment of that site to actually add organic matter. And so one of the ways we can do that is adding peat moss. Peat moss is both acidic as well as being organic matter. So organic matter, when I'm saying that, that's just something that is living or was living. So very often we think of things that are plant materials. So it's everything from leaves and lawn clippings. You can include sawdust and wood chips, but we wouldn't ideally actually put those into the soil. We can create some nitrogen imbalances by dumping that much carbon into the soil. But again, we like rich organic matter. We also need soils to be well drained. So if you've got a spot that after it rains, it's squishy for a couple of days, that's not going to be where you put your blueberries. We need well drained soils. They do not like to have wet feet. We will absolutely kill those roots, and without roots, we don't have plants. They do have a fine, shallow root system. And oddly enough, they do not have root hairs. So that impacts basically the efficiency or how well blueberries pull things out of the soil. So because of that fine, shallow root system, and we're talking about, and I think this number is conservative. We could probably up that to 80 to 90% of the roots are in the top foot of the soil. They are not ginormously rooted plants. That's a negative, because when we have a larger root system that reaches more broadly, we are able to get more nutrients from a wider area. And the same thing with water. Compounding the fact that the root system is smaller on these plants is the fact they don't have root hairs. So root hairs are all those fine extension on roots that massively increases the amount of surface area. And so the ability for the plant to get nutrients and water out of the soil. So blueberries are kind of got a double whammy. They have smaller root systems and they don't have root hairs. So that means we have to do a good job of preparing their root zone to do what it needs to do. We do like to have irrigation available, particularly with establishment on these. So if you plant these now and we get a hot, dry summer and you don't irrigate them at all, you can be looking at significant losses. They are not well suited, especially during establishment, to drought. Once they're well established, they can weather it better. It's not to say in a severe drought, they're still not going to be benefited from watering. They would be, but certainly during establishment, we want to be more sensitive to their water needs. And the reason we want to take care and talk about pH and organic matter and all that is this is iron deficiency symptoms on a blueberry. And so when we have pHs that are out of the appropriate acidic range, we're going to see this. We're going to see insufficient iron because pH directly affects the availability of nutrients. And so iron specifically is available at lower pHs. And when we don't have a pH low enough, blueberries will not get enough. And so when we're seeing this in a planting, we know, okay, we've got a soil problem. And the challenge is, how do we remediate soil conditions underneath a perennial plant? Short answer is we don't easily, and we might not be able to. So we might actually have to be starting over. So when we have a lot of problems with blueberries, one of the first questions to figure out is our soil where it needs to be? And if not, everything else we try to do to remediate it isn't going to work well because that's the underlying problem. So that's why we're so particular about establishment. So, talking about the types of blueberries, if you're going to go blueberry shopping, this is important because there's more than one kind of blueberries, broadly speaking. We have rabbit eye. They're the tallest, they're the longest lived, they're later ripening, if you remember from earlier. They're more tolerant to heat and drought, which is good, but can suffer some frost damage in East Tennessee, particularly at higher elevations. So, this is one that when we start getting below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, we can have some bud damage. Now, not every year are we going to get below 10 degrees or even 0 degrees, which is more severe for rabbit eye, but it's a possibility that occasionally we could see damage on these. So that's something to be aware of. So, in talking to Dave Lockwood, who is the semi-retired extension specialist for UT. I say semi-retired because he's still on because we haven't found a replacement for him yet. So he works part-time. I was talking to him last week. He was saying, if we could ever find a rabbit eye that had the early characteristics of harvest that you find in a high bush, nobody in this region would ever grow a high bush again because rabbit eyes are just a stronger, better plant. But they harvest later and they have a chance for damage in East Tennessee. So particularly, if we're talking Johnson County, higher elevations, rabbit eyes are going to see more problems with frost damage. So just be aware of that. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be used in our area. Just they come with that caveat. So if I was planting a number of bushes, probably look at a mix. I probably wouldn't go all completely one or the other. The other option, northern high bush. Good thing about northern high bush is they have a higher chill requirement, which means they'll start growing or blooming later in the spring, and they're naturally more cold tolerant anyway. So we have to be well below 0 before we get significant cold injury on these. They do have some more disease issues, and they're quite frankly not as strong of a plant. They're just not as robust. That being said, they certainly can grow and produce in our area, but we're going to really pay even more attention to those pre-plant considerations with northern high bush. There's also southern high bush that are basically hybrids between the two. They've not been well tested in Tennessee, so we really don't recommend those now. If you were to be looking at some of these, pay very close attention to chill hours on them. So again, chill hours is about how many hours below a certain temperature that plants accumulate. And once they've reached that, if we start getting warm periods, they can start blooming. And so that's why peaches are so difficult in our area, because a lot of the different peach cultivars have a lower than desired number of chill hours, which means they bloom too early. Same thing with a lot of these southern high bush. They simply won't work in our area except rarely. So we really wouldn't recommend them. If you want to try some as a trial, that would be okay, but really we wouldn't recommend it. You will also see some blueberries out there that are like container blueberries, kind of small miniature things. Those really aren't suited to growing out in our area year round necessarily. And to me, growing blueberries in a container is going to be very challenging, specifically because anything in a container is difficult to manage water on if we have a lot of growth and a lot of production. And so the fact we have blueberries that aren't the most efficient root system in a container makes me think it's a losing proposition rather than a winning proposition to have some in a container. So I'd probably encourage you to look at avoiding the small little dwarf cultivars that are for containers as well, because again, they're not really tested in our area and they're not really suited to multiple year production. Chilling hours, I kind of already said this. Basically, in our area, it wouldn't be unrealistic for us to get 14, 15, even 1600 chilling hours. A lot of rabbit eyes are on the lower end, even below 400. That's way too low. So if you're looking at rabbit eyes, make sure the 500 plus range, higher is better. You're not going to find a rabbit eye that has too many chill hour requirements or too high of a requirement. It's not going to happen in our area. Same thing with high bush. I don't believe there's any cultivar you would ever find that would be too high of requirement. So again, the higher the number, the later it's going to bloom. And so that's always a good thing with fruit, hopefully escaping those spring frosts. So rabbit eye, I've kind of said all this before, stronger, better plant overall. And again, watch those chilling hours because we do have some that are too low. I would not go below 500. This is a list of some cultivars. I would not say it necessarily covers everything out there. There's always new cultivars coming on. Sometimes some of the older ones might drop out and no longer be marketed if they're being replaced by something just as good in the market. But these are some to look at. There are other cultivars also listed in some of the publications that's in the resources. So just note that some of the ones on the right are newer and may be less tested in our area, but certainly understand that we do have, even within like rabbit eyes, we have those that are yielding or fruiting earlier, middle, and late. So you can extend that harvest. If you just select one variety, you can be okay, but basically all of the blueberries will benefit when you have more than one variety for cross pollination. So it is somewhat useful to look at when they're blooming, early, middle, or late. You'd like to see an overlap at least, if not the same for the two. So, like an early and a late are probably not the best for cross pollination, for instance. But two earlies or even a mid that has some overlap wouldn't be too bad either. Northern high bush, basically, we're going to be more particular about where we place them, how we place them. We're going to be even more cautious on the moisture side. And we're going to be aware there's more diseases associated with these. So if we see diseases, we're going to see it in northern high bush before we would see it in rabbit eye. And again, we like these. They're earlier. They're also less likely to see that frost damage in the spring. And so particularly if we are in a site that is more elevated, they make a lot of sense for us. Here are some varieties. A lot of these are older. It's not unusual, in more northern regions, they don't plant rabbit eye. We're kind of in the transition zone, and that's always the complexity with us. The joke with transition zones when it comes to growing plants is that we can't grow anything well. Uh, the truth is, we can grow a lot of things well. And sometimes we skate by and grow things we shouldn't. But it does come with that challenge that sometimes we get caught when we do that. And so just be aware the northern do give us that buffer on that. A lot of those varieties have been in production for decades. Those are not necessarily anything new. So, when you look for varieties, you can find things at big box stores. Sometimes there'll be good varieties there, sometimes not. And so that's the challenge. Buying online is great because lots of times you can find varieties you can't find locally. And again, these are some of the varieties we might see on the Southern High Bush. We don't suggest that you grow these. But again, if you wanted to try something, there might be an option. I will say on some of these, it's talking about that, they have been trialed in Tennessee. Mostly they've been trialed in West and Middle Tennessee. And East Tennessee is a little bit different. So even if Middle and West Tennessee are seeing success, I would still be cautious with these. So, does one type have a better fruit flavor than another? Maybe, if that's what you think. They're all blueberries, and certainly there are some that might have a higher sugar content than others. But if you let them get ripe on the plant, you're going to have something you're happy to eat. Typically, we do see larger berry size with high bush. So there we see a blueberry covering a quarter for well-managed high bush, and particularly with some varieties that have larger fruit. That's not an exaggeration. That's not going to be uncommon to find that. There are some that have more firmer texture than others. So be aware of that. Seediness can vary as well. One thing that we want to think about is SWD. And in the world of fruit, that's spotted winged Drosophila. And we'll talk about that later on in a little more detail. But one of the things that makes me favor high bush slightly for us is this insect pest. It's basically a fruit fly, and we'll talk several slides over it because it is an important one to talk about. So again, really cover this. This is kind of redundant, so we'll just skip it. Same thing. The one thing to be aware of rabbit eyes, if you have a large planting, you are picking during the hottest part of the summer. So this is maybe one thing to take in consideration on the numbers of plants you have. do a mixture and just realize, do you want to be picking late July and August in the heat? Certainly, we can pick in the morning when it's cooler, but still, it does happen to be the warmer part of summer. So I've said it before. The beginning is really where we can set ourselves up for success. We do want to make sure that we do a good job with site preparation. And so that really is focusing on pH. So, how do we know what our pH is? We have a soil test from a lab. I know of no soil kit, no soil meter that is useful for home operation. There are some meters that are used in the greenhouse world, and you have to know how to use them properly. But there is no home kit that is reliable, period. When researchers at UT are doing field tests, they send it off to the soil lab because they need to know what's there. And so, whether you're using a UT soil lab, a private soil lab, doesn't matter. But a good number on pH is going to come from a laboratory process, not from something we can do at home. So just be aware of that. Certainly, we want to look at the other nutrients that are reported. Are we okay? Do we need to adjust those? But without pH being right, fertilizer doesn't do a lot. So we want to make sure we get that pH correct. We do want to add organic matter. So I mentioned earlier peat moss. What we want to avoid, though, is kind of the bucket effect. What we mean by that is it's very common that people want to plant a plant, they amend the immediate area where they're placing the roots of that plant and nowhere else. So they create a little spot, a little bucket of soil that is completely different from all the soil around it. That's bad. And we've got a picture here in a moment. It's bad because it doesn't encourage the roots to grow out into that different soil. We can have issues with how water flows. So it could be waterlogged or it could be high and dry, depending on pore size on the adjoining soil. So having distinctly different soil is bad. So what's good is mixing it in over a larger area. So instead of creating just a little bucket of different soil with our peat, we might do 2 to 3 inches and work that in over the length of the bed. I'd rather have 2 to 3 inches over the length of the bed as opposed to a few gallons right in one spot, because that one spot that is different is going to create problems. And if we mix in over the area, when those roots are starting to grow out from the root ball, they're going to see very similar soil. We do oftentimes plant blueberries on a slightly raised bed. Doesn't have to be anything dramatic. It can just be a couple of inches. It can be where we hill it up. If we use a rototiller to work in amendments, for instance, or it can be just where we do it by hand with a shovel or a spade. So it doesn't have to be a raised bed in the sense of something formal with edging and things like that. But even just a couple of inches higher can help make sure we've got good drainage. Gravity is our friend when it comes to water drainage. So having a couple of inch bed will help us improve drainage over that native soil. Does mean it's going to dry out a little bit faster than just that native soil would. But I'd rather have to worry about irrigating some and not have wet feet than the opposite, because we can't have wet root conditions.
I've heard you're supposed to plant blueberries on a hill. Would that be something that would benefit them?
So you could plant blueberries on a hill. It wouldn't be a have to situation. There's nothing that would be negative about planting on a hill necessarily. Sometimes, depending on what part of the hill we're on, we can have more shallow soils. So we want to pay attention to that. But certainly, a lot of our fruit sites often end up on hills, and part of it is cold air drainage. So cold air will move like water does, it flows down here. So when we have an inversion layer and we have cold air against the ground where it shouldn't be, if it's on a hillside, lots of times it will basically fall into the valley. That's why valley temperatures are typically cooler than ridge temperatures. And that's what we try to take advantage of when we site a lot of fruit on hills, is avoiding a frost pocket that we have down in the valley. So yeah, on the micro scale where you're planting, having it on a higher elevation as opposed to down and lower, generally we do see wetter conditions lower, but also frost would be a consideration. So yeah, planting on a hill is not bad at all for these. And certainly a raised bed on a hill will work just as well as it will on flatter land. So that's not a problem either. One thing that we want to be aware of, things like compost and manures, they can raise pH. If you look at the pH of a lot of compost, they are naturally and by nature a higher or more alkaline substance. So it's not to say that we can't use them, but we want to understand that if we're adding those into the soil, we're also fighting them on a pH scale. So just be aware that if we are using manures or compost, manures, I'm always afraid of weed seeds in there if they're not fully composted. So just be aware of that too. But certainly we can use compost as a nutrient additive to those soils, but just do it judiciously, perhaps, so that we don't create a pH issue. I am going to encourage you to use reputable nurseries. And again, I'm not saying we can't buy from a local big box store, but chances are we can get better plants, maybe from somewhere else. So I always encourage folks to look at nurseries. And one of those reasons, again, comes down to variety. At the big box store, you've got what they've got. There have been instances of Tennessee, like with apples, big box retailers selling apples that Dave Lockwood again said probably shouldn't have been planted in the U.S. north of Miami. They were literally a subtropical apple, but they were for sale in the state of Tennessee. He bought it and brought it to a training. Just understand, just because it's at the store doesn't mean it's going to do what you want it to do. And so that's why I like using online sources, nurseries that specialize in fruit, just because oftentimes we can get those specific varieties that are best suited to us. And I will say, don't substitute varieties. Varieties are a big deal, and types are a big deal. So, don't put Southern High Bush in unless you're willing to accept that they're a big question. So again, rabbit eye and high bush are two options for us. We can have pluses and minuses for both. I think, for someone that's wanting to have several plants, a combination between the two is not a bad plan. But certainly don't go with a variety simply because it's available, because it may be, for instance, a rabbit eye that has a very low chilling requirement, which means it's going to routinely lose its blossoms every year, which means all your effort has been wasted if those blossoms are getting killed by every spring frost. So varieties are extremely important. So why am I so adamant about preparing the year before? What we have to understand is the way we change pH and make it more acidic is basically by applying elemental sulfur. The reaction that takes place is actually a biological reaction. So the soil bacteria actually convert the sulfur ultimately into sulfuric acid, and that's what lowers the pH. So we have to ask the question, well, when are those bacteria active? Well, when our soils are warm, moist, and aerated. So really, we need soil temperatures above 55 degrees before this is even happening. So, we can apply sulfur in the fall, for instance, but how cool are our soils over winter? Are they below 55 degrees? For a good portion of the winter, yes. So that means nothing's happening. So when we do liming or sulfur, either one to the soil to change pH, the full effects of what we apply can be a year or even 18 months later before we see the final effect. And so that's why I'm saying do this a year prior. Earlier is better. And so it is important, and it's because it's not an instant reaction. It's not where we're putting fertilizer on and it's immediately available to the plant. We're applying an elemental sulfur product. That takes time to work. We also like to incorporate it into the soil. It just gets it to the soil bacteria faster. We can apply it to the surface, but it takes longer. How long does it take for lime or sulfur, either one, to go down into the soil profile? Takes some time. Has to be carried by water, or maybe some of our little, soil microorganisms moving around. But incorporation makes it happen faster. There are other materials we can look at. So iron sulfate, for instance, does work faster. Problem is it's more expensive, and we literally use 6 times as much. 1 pound of elemental sulfur is equal to 6 pounds of iron sulfate. So on a somewhat large scale, it becomes unwieldy, and we do reach a point where we want to not apply more than a certain amount, because with it or the alternative aluminum sulfate, which I would highly tell you not to use, we can end up with XF iron and aluminum at low pHs. We can actually get aluminum toxicity, especially. So I highly encourage you not to look at aluminum sulfate, and even iron sulfate is not the best option. So if we were wanting to do, if you had some hydrangeas and you're wanting to change the color on them, maybe use iron sulfate for that in a flower bed. But I don't think I'd use it for changing the pH of blueberry plantings. I would stick with elemental sulfur. So what does a site preparation really entail? We want to make sure we kill the weeds that are present. And so lots of times we're planting into sod areas. Not necessarily, but lots of times it's a sod area. So we need to do a good job of killing that. I'm a big fan of using herbicides to do this. There are other options, things like occulation, which is using the heavy tarps, things like that to remove sunlight can work because we have time to do this. But we do want to do a good job of that. We want to make sure we get that soil tested. I cannot tell you how much sulfur to use until we know the pH. And I don't know the pH until you get a soil tested. Yes.
Ready to use some dirt?
Yeah. So if you want to use your local friendly neighborhood extension office, what you do is you collect the top 6 to 8 inches. And so some folks, when they do perennial crops like fruit, they like to do 2 soil samples. They'll do like 0 to 6 or 8 inches, and then they'll do like 8 to 12 inches in depth and have 2. You have a subsoil and then the upper soil. For most home gardeners, that's probably a little overkill if you just do the top 8 inches, because again, the vast majority of a blueberry's roots are going to be in the top 8 to 10 inches anyway. And so what you do is over the area you're planting, take multiple samples to that 8 to 10 inch depth. We don't want roots, sticks, rocks, any surface debris in that sample. You throw those small samples all together in a bucket, mix them up well, and pull 1 sample out of there. Because what we're hoping to get is an average over the planting area. So if it's a 30-foot row, you might have taken 6, 8, 10 samples over the length of it. Because from one end to the other, we could have some real measurable differences in things. But what we're hoping to get is that average. And that's why we pull that composite sample out of all the smaller samples. We need about, if you bring in a quart-size Ziploc bag most of the way full, that is sufficient to send off. We send it off to the lab at UT. They will conduct the process. It's about 2 weeks. The cost is $20. You can pay online and send it to the lab yourself or do it through us. It will cost you more than $10 to send it through the post office if you send one. So we charge $5 shipping. We don't use soil samples as an income generator. In 23, we lost a few $100s on shipping soil samples because we're not good business people. But it is something that we do as a service. We look at it as a service. So there are certainly private labs you can use. Some of the private labs will give a little bit different reports. The UT lab does not report, for instance, soil organic matter or nitrogen. Nitrogen is not a great test for soil samples because it changes very quickly. So the nitrogen that's available today is probably not going to be available tomorrow. So the interpretation from nitrogen is hard anyway. And we can add on a test that would tell us, for instance, like percent organic matter, but it is an additional charge for us. Some labs include that automatically. It just depends where you're going. And again, any professional lab is suitable. It doesn't have to be a UT lab at all. But certainly, I know people are always encouraged when we give them a soil test recommendation. We're not telling you to buy fertilizer if you don't need it. We're not in the fertilizer business, so there's never a chance or any doubt that we're just telling you what the numbers are coming back from those tests. And so, yeah, so I do think soil testing is critical. If I'm going to invest the money and the effort in planting these, I'm going to make sure I know what I need to do on the soil side to get everything right. We might want to look at using a cover crop. So like if we get our soil test back, we add the amendments, we incorporate those, like we till up the area. We might even use tillage to kill the weeds that are present or grass that's present. We might want to use something like a cover crop to hold that space. We just have bare ground there, we're going to have weeds come in. We know it. So, planting something, if it's we have warm season temperatures, so if we're in May or later, something like buckwheat, cheap seed, easy to establish, has flowers on it, so pollinators like it. We might do that, or any number of possible cover crops. If that's something you're interested in, talk to me. I can help you figure out something. We typically are planting our plants in February or March. So that's why somewhat the timing of this class. And so generally we do want dormant plants. You'll see some pictures as we go through here of plants that are well leafed out. That is not ideal at all. We would want to avoid that. We would prefer to have a dormant plant that we are planting. We'll have better results. But sometimes you do what you have to do. There is the possibility maybe of fall or winter planting, but a lot of that comes down to availability of plants. So lots of times the big push for plant availability is for that dormant planting period in February and March. And so you won't necessarily have plants readily available for the fall or winter, but it is technically possible. I mentioned earlier, we do like raised beds. Again, this is not something dramatic, but we do see certainly that benefit of getting gravity more in play on water drainage. We don't want the roots of plants to dry out. So if we are getting in plants such as these, we want to open up the boxes as soon as we get it. Don't ever let plant material stay in a closed box. Open it up. If we have them laying around like this, where we've got wet roots on top of branching material, pull them out. We don't want stems to stay wet. So get them out, get them upright so those stems will dry out. And certainly so we can see, do we need to water? Sometimes we might need to water these before we get them into the ground. We don't want to stick them in a bucket of water for days on end. Sometimes people do that with bare root plants, especially. We have them in there for an hour before we're planting. That's good. It doesn't take hours and hours or days to accomplish some hydration. So if we can't plant these quickly, we do want to look at maybe hilling them in. And basically, hilling them in is just temporarily covering them with dirt or mulch somewhere. So lots of times people will hill them in on the edge of a garden. You can even do it in a container if you have potting soil or mulch available. It's just a way basically to keep the roots moist. We don't want these plants to be inside our house heated. We want these ambient temperature outside. So on a porch, in an unheated garage, maybe, but we don't want these at 65, 70 degrees in a house because we're going to encourage it to start growing. And we don't want that to happen. We're going to stick it outside and we've got more winter weather to follow. So do consider where you're placing these once you get them, if you can't plant them immediately. Spacing within the row, high bush is a little bit tighter because they're a little bit smaller plant. Rabbit eye, a little bit wider, bigger plant. And you can see there between rows is a similar spacing. Good thing about blueberries, unlike other small fruit like our caneberries, we typically don't worry about any sort of trellising or anything like that. There's a scenario where having some structure can be helpful. We'll talk about towards the end, but ordinarily they're completely self-supporting and we don't have to worry about it. We don't just want to dig a hole that's the exact same size of the container because, again, we want the soil to be worked up some. If we are doing something that isn't just a bare root plant where there's no root ball, we want to break that root ball apart. So if we can't easily break it apart with our hands, we can cut the roots with a knife. We want it to be not root bound. So when we have a container, it's very easy. When those roots start growing out, they hit the container walls and then they start circling. If we don't stop that, if we don't interrupt it, they'll continue to circle in the ground because that's the way they're growing. So cutting that root ball apart, breaking it apart with our fingers is a really good practice to get into with almost anything you're planting that has a root ball. There's very few exceptions to that. Maybe the cucurbits, so squash and cucumbers, when we transplant them, a lot of them don't like to have root disturbance. Other than that, more things are benefited by it than will be harmed. We do want to make sure we water these in well. And so that may mean if we have larger plants that we fill the hole halfway, water, and then fill it the rest of the way and water a second time. So there's nothing wrong with having more than one watering event. And one of the things that water does helps remove air pockets. We don't want air pockets in the soil around those roots. Roots don't grow through air pockets. And so It's not unusual after you water to see some subsidence of the soil, some dropping, and so you may push more soil around it after you do that. Again, pH is the big thing. Don't create the bucket issue where we have a small little site that's drastically different because we've dumped a ton of organic matter in there, particularly when we have clay soils like we often do in our area, unless you're in one of our river bottoms. That just makes everything worse if we have that very distinct difference. In sandy soils, kind of the same thing. We can have a lot of drying out rather than maybe waterlogging, but certainly having a broad mix accomplished rather than one small site is better. Here you can see to the right some blueberry plants. Again, that is not ideal at all to have plants that are in leaf, and I think those actually might even be blooming. So that's wrong all the way around. But things happen sometimes and things get delayed. So if you can avoid it, avoid it. So this is a scenario of a plant that was plopped in the ground and they didn't do anything to disturb that root ball. So basically, this is a 3-year-old plant. So it was probably planted 2 years ago. And you can see they were able to lift it out of the ground. Why? Because that root ball didn't do anything. It just sat. So this is why we want to disturb those roots. We want to get that root growth active out into the surrounding soil. So making sure that at planting, we prune those, we cut them again, knives, pruning shears, whatever it takes, depending on how rigorous of a root growth or root ball it has, is going to benefit us. And again, if we have dry soil at planting and don't do a good job of watering them in, we just at best we delay performance, and sometimes we prevent performance. So we want to make sure we do a good job with this. Mulches are great for blueberries. So mulches, one of the big benefits is it increases soil moisture, it retains moisture better, it competes against weeds. So we love organic mulches on blueberries. Sometimes people will wonder, well, what mulch should I use? There's any number that work well, everything from wood chips to pine bark to pine straw to almost any organic matter is going to be equally good.
You work that in.
I would not work that in. No, I would leave this as a surface mulch because the problem with working in mulches into the soil is most of the time they are very carbon rich. That's why they last on the soil surface. So, like grass clippings, for instance, have a fairly decent ratio of nitrogen to carbon. Wood chips, bark mulches, things like that have a ton of carbon and very little nitrogen, which means if they get worked into the soil, if your soil microbes start attacking them, the soil microbes will grab all the available nitrogen and there won't be enough for your plant. Because we can kind of think of carbon as a food source and they're using the nitrogen to replicate. So we've thrown them an all you can eat buffet. So they're going to grab all the nitrogen they can for replication because there's enough resources to reproduce. And so that's why we don't work these into the soil specifically. So, I mean, and yes, sphagnum peat moss or peat moss is carbon rich, but we're doing it specifically to raise organic matter and the fact it has some acidity associated with it.
I'm going to ask you a question.
Please do.
So with red clay, which we have, we say take a soil sample of the dirt as it is.
Yep.
Get the soil sample back, and then let's say you take a tiller and till you 2 foot wide path and put some peat moss in there.
Yes.
Fill it in to the dirt.
So what I would do is when I was establishing beds the year prior, I'm going to put down my sulfur and I'm going to put down peat moss most likely, and I'm going to till those into that soil. Because what I want to do is I want to get the sulfur down more into the environment where the bacteria are. I want the peat moss down there just overall. I don't want it left only on the surface. And that gives me a good mix over the depth that tiller and width that tiller is making.
Sulfur is something you can buy at the co-op.
Possibly. I don't know if they'll have it in stock or if you'll have to buy it. Sometimes it's available in small bags readily, but you may have to talk to someone to get them to order larger quantities because you can get it in 40 or 50-pound bags. And depending on how large an area you're preparing, you might need that. So it just depends on what your pH is and how large an area you're preparing. I like these surface mulches because, again, over time they do break down. And so they can add organic matter. One thing sometimes people ask about is like pine needles are reputed to be acidic, and I would agree with that. Pine straw or pine needles are acidic, but as a mulch, they do not change soil pH. So I know of no organic mulch that we would be using that's going to be changing the soil pH. And we would never use peat moss because when peat moss gets dry, it's hydrophobic. It won't absorb water. So if we use peat moss ever on the surface, it gets dry, then we get a rain, your peat moss leaves. So we don't ever use peat moss on the surface. And that's another reason why we would work it into the soil. So for all the reasons mulches are good in our vegetable garden, around our perennial plants like trees, same thing here. And there's absolutely increased yields when we do a good job with mulching on blueberries. There's no doubt about it. There are sometimes problems. So this was actually a trial that UT put out. You see there the black landscape mulching fabric. Nothing wrong with using that. I prefer organic if I've got the option, but there's nothing wrong with this. And in fact, underneath that plastic landscape fabric mulch is organic mulch. It wasn't doing the job. So they planted into a grassy area. They didn't quite have the weed control they should have. So they were having a weed problem coming through the mulch. And so they came back and basically put this on as a second layer of mulch to accomplish the job of weed suppression. And it worked. What to be aware of is even though these fabrics do allow water and air to penetrate, they do shed water some. So you'll notice they have drip irrigation on top of the fabric. And we'll have another picture, I think, in a moment. They actually have individual emitters going to the plant. So it's not drip tape, it's orchard tubing with individual emitters. If you've never used drip tape or don't plan to, don't worry about it. If you do, then you probably understand what I'm saying and why it's important. And again, I think there's a picture after this that tells us that. So again, irrigation is important. We want to do this at establishment for sure, especially on high bush. It's still going to benefit rabbit-eye if it's hot and dry. And even in later years, we're going to get a better yield. We're going to get more growth when we have irrigation on these plants. Doesn't mean it's an absolute have to, but it is helpful. We don't have to soak these plants. Again, the top 6 or 8 inches of the soils where most of the roots are, we're not going to benefit by wetting it to 18 inches deep. In fact, we're just going to push nutrients away from our plant. So we really talk about 1 inch per week. And certainly in the hotter periods, it might be more than that. Drip tape is good. There are heavier versions for multi-season use. If you're familiar with drip tape, there's also ones that aren't as long lived. And then certainly there's even things like orchard tubing that we can attach emitters to. And so this is an example of orchard tubing. It's a fairly thick wall for tubing. And then you have individual emitters that are placed at the plants. So you can see there, it's not leaking water along the length. It is immediately on that plant. Fertility does not have to be too complex. When we have that soil test, you're going to get back the general recommendations. As the plants grow, as they get older, approaching it on a per plant basis makes sense from the home aspect of it, because typically we don't have a large area we're doing. We do want to do a good job when we fertilize of spreading it over an area. We don't just want to dump it in one spot or just do one little area, because we are dealing with salts when we deal with fertilizers. Even with compost, there's salts in there, and those can damage roots. And again, we already have a root system that's not the greatest in the world, so we want to avoid messing that up at all. And blueberries are salt sensitive. So over fertilization is definitely not a good plan. Don't think, well, if a little is good, more is better. You can actually harm that plant. We do look at the source of nitrogen because blueberries do prefer ammonium sources for nitrogen as opposed to nitrate, for instance. So we do look and pay attention to that. And again, if we aren't irrigating our berries, we probably aren't going to fertilize them much. because we can't take advantage of that fertilization, and we're more likely to see salt stress associated with those plants. So we certainly don't heavilize heavily. If we're seeing drier conditions, we would delay it or maybe not even do it at all. We don't necessarily have to fertilize the first year that we plant, but we can, especially if we didn't do it at preparation. If we did some amendment at preparation, or we did it immediately prior to planting, I would not do anything further. But here you can see, and this is from a University of Georgia publication, an approach as a age of the plant, and then some possible sources of material that we could use. And you can see there that we're using, a few ounces when it's 2 years old, up to maybe 8 ounces or a half pound when they are up to 6 years, when they're more basically fully mature. And so the specific recommendations are for rabbit eye, and we would probably cut those back for high bush. So if you grow high bush and have a question, I can help get you the specific requirements or recommendations for that. But again, not a tremendous amount of fertility. We do want to be aware of pollination. All blueberries benefit by cross pollination. Some of them are more self-fruitful than others. We do have pollination that's happening by insects, primarily bees. So there actually is a blueberry bee, but also are honeybees and bumblebees. Sometimes bumblebees can actually cut open a flower from the side. That's not a good thing because that actually leads to less than great pollination, but that can sometimes happen. We do like for improved pollination to have those bloom times of cultivars overlapping. So we do encourage cross pollination by planting similarly flowering blueberries. So it is a good plan. Some are less requirement of it. High bush particularly has some varieties that are nearly, if not fully, self-fertile. But again, it is generally speaking better to have them. So here is a picture of a bumblebee that is sonicating or vibrating. So, the smaller bees will actually get further deeper inside the flower. Bumblebees obviously cannot, but they will actually basically buzz the flower, and that will accomplish the task. And so it is actually kind of interesting and neat that they do that. So pruning. So this is one that I know there's a lot of interest in, so I'm going to spend a few slides on it. First year at planting, basically, kind of like we've seen with some of the other things we've talked about, we're cutting away a lot of material. We basically just want a few sticks left at the end, 10 to 12 inches tall, because just like with everything else, whether it's fruit trees or cane berries, we want to establish good architecture, and we can only do that basically by starting from scratch. When we get these plants, they do not have the structure we want. If we don't prune them, we're setting ourselves back, creating more problems in the future. So as hard as it is to buy something and then cut it back to spindling nothing, that's exactly the best thing to do. So we are looking at removing side branches. If we have any damage, cutting that out. And again, having this basically blank slate to start growing for that first season. Absolutely, we're going to make sure we remove any flower buds or fruit buds, however you want to refer to those, because we only want this plant growing vegetatively. We don't want it putting any energy into blooming. It's just a waste. And again, for container grown plants, make sure we cut those roots apart. We use our fingers, whatever it takes to get that root growth out. Looking at a blueberry plant, basically our fruit buds are the largest ones, typically towards the tip of branches. They are more round in appearance. The leaf buds typically are smaller, further back on the branch, and more pointed. To demonstrate that, here is a picture. And certainly when they start to swell some in spring, it's even more exaggerated. But certainly we see probably 3 flower buds there, and then starting with the 4th bud, we are seeing vegetative growth. So if this was year 2, if we had planted it last year, and we come in this time of year to do some pruning, we would want to cut off the first 3 buds of that plant, because we do not want this plant fruiting yet. And so the other thing we can do is rub those off with our hands. So we don't literally have to cut. We can actually rub them off and remove them. Either way is acceptable. Depending on how many you have to do, one way might be superior to the other. Again, we want to at least the first 2 years after planting not have it fruit. Third year, it still isn't a bad idea to remove some blooms, particularly if maybe that plant isn't growing as well as we might hope. So if we have one that we see isn't perhaps as good at performing, didn't establish as well for some reason, we might especially want to delay even the third year. But again, pruning or rubbed off. Rabbit eyes, if we have very vigorous rabbit eyes, which it is possible to have, if there's a few flower buds on there the second year, so you get a few berries, it's not going to be the end of the world. But we shouldn't see a full fruit load on there. That is definitely going to be a problem. So again, delaying fruit the first few years is going to give us better returns later. We'll have more fruit because of it. Pruning is not just removing things, it's also training that plant into the plant we want to be there the next year and years after. One of the things we do with established plants is get out the oldest wood, the oldest bearing material, so that we have new vigorous things coming on. So we'll end up, as these plants get established, too much plant and too little space. And so as they become mature, a lot of what we're doing is thinning things out. Basically, we'd like to remove 10 to 20% of the canes each year. Those will be the oldest canes we remove because they're less productive. So basically, on average, the oldest cane we might see in a plant is 6 to 7 years old at the oldest, because we remove them the oldest every year. We do like doing this in the dormant season, which is this time of year, late winter, early spring. We don't really want to do this in the fall. One of the responses to plants and pruning is to produce new growth. We talked about this on like pruning fruit trees. We prune the most cold hardy fruit first because we might get a response and it might encourage them to grow earlier. So kind of the same idea. We definitely don't want to encourage early growth. So we wait, early March is not out of line for pruning blueberries at all.
Adam,
Yes,
you consider aeration like you would your fruit free pruning?
you do. And so we'll talk about that. But yeah, so basically the same principles we think about of opening a plant up, getting good sunlight and air penetration, the same ideal. We're just doing it on a little bit smaller scale. And so, and then the same principles apply. Wet areas lead to more disease problems. So what we basically do for mature plants is narrow the base. So removing small twiggy growth, especially things on the lower, because they're not going to fruit well anyway. They're shaded by the upper portions. We don't necessarily want to be bending over and getting fruit on the very bottom. We remove a few of the oldest canes in there. You're going to see younger canes look different than older canes. Typically, the older canes have more of a bark appearance. A lot of the younger canes will have more of a reddish brown appearance. It doesn't really look like bark per se. We can also do some heading back. If you remember the fruit trees, we head back when we want to encourage branching and growth. And there are scenarios where we want to do that with blueberries. So sometimes we do head back. Other times we may just thin out older canes. Both are acceptable depending on what the end goal is. So here's an example of that. We can see left there a well-established plant. They are cutting back some of the tallest cane there to help control height. You can absolutely keep these plants at a manageable height. So just because you have rabbit eye that are wanting to grow taller doesn't mean you have to allow it. You can keep them lower to where it's easier for you to manage and pick. And then just by and large, the contrast between the two is you are thinning out that canopy. You're giving more airspace vertically and horizontally to what you leave behind. And what will happen is as the growing season begins, you'll have new growth coming up. So next year when you go in there, it'll look again like on the left. You have some younger things that you don't keep, some younger things you do keep, some older things you keep, and some older things you don't keep. So again, it's kind of just balancing what's there. You don't want too much plant in that area because again, too much means we don't get the harvest we want. If we're looking on high bush, shorter plant, but essentially the process is the same. We're thinning it out, we're opening it up. And again, the same ideal is that we can absolutely head back vigorous growth to keep it more manageable in size. We're less likely to have these outgrow us just because of the nature of high bush plants. But it is something to be aware that we do have the option. But again, the biggest thing is anything that is damaged, disease looking, we're always going to take that material out first, and then we thin and open these plants up, removing a lot of the lower growth as well as small spindly growth that isn't going to be strong and fruiting for us. Because again, by thinning these plants out, what we're really literally doing is we're reducing the fruit load, which means we'll get more bigger fruit and less small fruit. So it's not really that we're reducing the productive capacity, we're just putting it into a smaller fruit count. And so that means individually the fruit's going to be larger. I grabbed this from Ohio State because, again, it's just reinforcing that same ideal on mature plants. This is specifically, they were talking about high bush because basically in Ohio, all you plant is high bush. You can't get away with rabbit eye like we can. But the principle there, I just like their demonstration of it. Again, when you come in there in this dormant season, you're going to have more growth than you need, and then you can thin it out and open it up. I just thought they had a good illustration of that. You can find examples where they have a very open center. So Virginia Tech, I was looking through some of their materials. They were showing some examples where they're really opening up the center to where in like this example, the middle Y-shaped cane, they would have removed completely. And so you kind of have two distinct separate sides and an open middle. Perfectly acceptable because it's kind of just doing what we do on open vase pruning of stone fruits. You're just opening up the middle to get more air sunlight into that center. It's not a bad way to do it, but generally speaking, it's not as dramatic as we would do with stone fruit trees, for instance. But I did see some examples that look pretty dramatic. I also included a little blurb there from this publication from Ohio State because what I like is not every single variety even of the same kind. So not every high bush variety, not every rabbit eye variety is going to grow in the same manner. You're going to find some are more upright, some are more sprawling, some never grow as fast as the other. It doesn't mean they won't fruit well for you. It's just no two varieties are identical. So don't be too concerned if you have different varieties that look different. And you may prune them a little differently because of that. And so I really like that Ohio State mentioned that because it's very true. When you have multiple varieties of the same fruit, you will see differences. And so that's not a bad thing. It's just the nature of how it is. So don't think everything's always going to look the same. I firmly believe that every example they've ever put for pruning is not a real world example because I've never seen what's in the book out in the real world, but the concepts, the principles hold true. And so just think about what we're doing of thinning out, removing the oldest canes and opening that plant up in general. There are scenarios where we have neglected blueberries, which I know nobody on here or here in person would ever fall into this category. But if you have blueberries that haven't been pruned properly and they're really a mess, and it can happen, there is a scenario where we can do some rejuvenation. And so if we're talking about rabbit eyes, we have basically cut it back to just a 6 or 12-inch stub, kind of starting over. With high bush, we're actually wanting root suckers to sprout. So we basically cut it off at ground level. And so basically we can start over. It's not to say that this would be as good as replanting new varieties and making sure our soil is where it should be. But if we have something that just looks terrible and has not been producing for us, we really don't have anything to lose by trying this. And so this can be a way to maybe give those berries a shot and doing some other things, making sure they're watered during dry periods, maybe doing some surface application of elemental sulfur to get our pH down after we've done a soil test. Some things like that may help increase the productivity of what we already have. Because sometimes things get away from us. It happens. But again, the best crop is going to be from those plants that we've been able to maintain from planting. So harvest, just a few points. We can do it in the morning when it's cool. We do want to look for uniform blue color. Fully mature fruit is going to have kind of a waxy appearance to it, almost like a whitish or gray color. We typically harvest every 5 to 7 days. Depends on what variety, depends on temperatures. The higher the temperature, the more frequently we're going to be picking. We don't want it to be raining or picking wet fruit. It does not hold well. So if it's wet fruit, consume it quickly, freeze it quickly. Don't leave it sitting around because that's a perfect environment for every sort of decay organism to grow. We do want to be pulling out any bad berries as we're picking and taking them out of the growing area. I'll tell you why in a minute. And we do like to store these cool. So you'll notice 35 to 33 is actually lower than most refrigerators. Most refrigerators are set just about under 40. So we can actually store these approaching freezing without damaging the fruit. So if we can be a little cooler, that's not a bad thing. When we have them cooled well, when they're in high humidity in storage, which we can accomplish that by having them in a closed container so they're not losing water as quickly, we can easily store these for a week in the refrigerator or longer. So just be aware we do have some storage potential. So once upon a time, I would have told you that blueberries were probably our best suited fruit to someone who didn't ever want to spray anything for insect pests. Unfortunately, that time is not now. We now have a new exotic insect called spotted winged Drosophila. So basically, it's a fruit fly. Unlike most fruit flies, this actually attacks intact fruit. Generally, fruit flies need something damaged, whether it's overripe, physically damaged, it's dropped on the ground. There has to be something creating an opening for the female to lay eggs. With this particular fruit fly, it actually has a serrated ovipositor. That's what they use to lay the eggs, so it can actually poke holes in perfectly good fruit. And so that's why this is such a challenge and why we've now pushed blueberries down the line as far as in concerns of insect damage. So specifically what we're looking for is we have a larva that emerges. The larva is basically a fly maggot. Nobody wants that in their fruit. We can actually see little bitty pinholes where the egg was laid. Fruits will get soft and mushy when they are infested with the larva and even start to kind of shrink down because that larva is consuming the interior and it's losing moisture. So sometimes we'll start to see some shrinking. It's not just blueberries they can be on. It can be on basically every berry we grow. The easiest approach is to pick frequently. So we don't see these in fruit until they start to show color. Of course, we want them to get fully colored before we pick them, but definitely not letting fruit get overripe. If we see a damaged berry, get it out of the picking area. Don't just throw it on the ground because that's just going to let those larvae mature and then they'll be attacking subsequent berries that grow. So we do want to do a good job with sanitation. There are spray options for this. We do have the ability to use some insecticides. There is some organic products that are approved, spinosad, such as listed there at that top line. That's depending on the exact formulation, that is approved for organic certified farms. It can be used. Certainly, we have non-organic products like malathion or pyrethrins or pyrethroids also are possible. But this is something to be aware of. It's not a guarantee that you're going to have it. There are some traps you can make for monitoring that either use a dough and mixture basically to make yeast, which is highly attractive to them, or apple cider vinegar that can be placed in a trap, which is less attractive, but maybe a little bit easier to deal with. So you can monitor for it. There is some thought that on a small scale, you can use very fine mesh bags to cover. Again, we have those fruit blossoms and berries are at the end of branches, so you can actually cover branches at the end with very fine mesh. Floating row covers. I mentioned earlier about floating row structure might be useful. There's a scenario where we could use floating row covers to seal off the plant after pollination and maybe keep this out. The danger is, what if we seal in the spotted winged Drosophila inside there? But certainly this is something to be aware of. If you're starting to see a lot of loss on berries, this very well may be it. There are some tests you can do on the resources. There is a link from the University of Georgia berry blog, if I remember correctly, that they talk about a couple of different ways. Basically, you can smash fruit and either have it in salt water or sugar water, and you can actually visibly see if there's larvae present. So that can be a way to determine, is that my problem? So there is a few diseases worth mentioning. Mummyberry is one that we can have recurring. So if we start seeing this pop up, we want to do a good job with sanitation. So we'd want to rake clean the berry yard at the end of the season and probably renew the mulch or come in with new mulch and bury it significantly, 3 inches or more. That can help us with mummyberry. There are some fungicides that might be possible, but by and large, in the home scenario, we don't see those used a lot. There is one disease, Phomopsis twig blight, that can be pretty devastating. So if we start seeing dieback in the berries, we'd want to maybe possibly send this off through our diagnostic lab and get them to make a determination, because certainly this could be a problem too. So again, by and large, blueberries are not prone to diseases, but it can happen. So we do like to remove plant litter to reduce mummyberry overwintering. When we have dead materials and twigs, when we're doing our pruning, we're getting that out of there. And again, we do have those fungicides listed in the home fruit planting, the home fruit disease and insect control. Yes.
Right. The same thing as what I've seen is, I think it's called bird nest fungi.
Yes. So the form of it when it grows just on dead plant material like that is the little bird nest fungus. So I think that would be classified as a bird nest fungus. So it creates these little cups, and basically you have spores that are produced in the center of that cup. And so, well, there's artillery fungus that shoots out of there. I am not certain if mummyberry shoots out of there. I know it sounds goofy, but I swear artillery fungus is exactly what it sounds like. It literally will shoot spores out of these cups, and it's very noticeable on houses. It will stick on the siding of a house. Someone will make a call to me and say, I've got all these dots all over the side of my house. We go out and we start looking in the flower beds, and they've got mulch down, and we start seeing these fungal cups. And those spots do not wash off easily. They stick really, really well. So I mean, it sounds goofy, but artillery fungus is actually very well named. So yeah, I do think this is similar. I'm not certain. I'd have to look it up to see if it has that propulsion method in this or not. It could just be rain splash, which is going to get it up on the plant effectively as well. But yeah, that's not a bad. It does make a similar cup to that. The question is, does it then propel it? So not a bad question. So the other thing to talk about pest and blueberries are birds and deer and neighbors, maybe. I don't know. But in all seriousness, bird netting and blueberries is not a bad plan. So depending on your exact situation, you can have a complete crop loss thanks to birds. Dave Lockwood the other week, he was doing a presentation, happened to be a vineyard, but basically it was a vineyard surrounded on 3 sides by woods. He said they never picked a grape out of there. And it was because there was just too high a pressure. So if you know you have a lot of wildlife, you can expect to be visited because you've got something they want, fruit. So, and the joke always is, everything comes the night before you figure out it's ripe. And that's when they make their harvest. But in all reality, this is where having some structure can make sense. So whether we're using it for like a floating row cover to exclude the spotted wing Drosophila, or we're doing it for bird netting, a structure may make sense. So although they don't necessarily need trellising for support and growth, it could come into play that if you have a structure there, it's going to pay off for you. So consider that when you're planting things, how you might come back and put in some bird netting, for instance, if that might be a problem. So the resources I mentioned, you can use this link or QR code to go directly to the PDF. If you signed up by email, I will send this to you along with the survey, along with the slides, and you should find that useful. This will also be placed on YouTube for you to review any section you'd like to. Again, as always, you're welcome to follow up with me with questions after this. If you're here tonight, there's cards out front with my contact info, and certainly you're welcome to stop by, but we're always in and out of the office, so call before you make a trip. But with that, are there any questions tonight?